The SEC closed submissions for comments around the proposed Bitcoin ETF, and specifically the ETFs that had previously declined the ETFs and then reversed their decision. With all that said and done, it's not these ETFs that the crypto community is banking on, but rather the ETF proposal that has been submitted by VanEck. Tonight I have Gabor Gurbacs joining me, and he is the Director of Digital Asset Strategy for VanEck. Gabor, you've got a big weight on your shoulders. You're the Director of Digital Asset Strategies at VanEck, and the whole crypto community has got their sights set on you guys, or their hopes set on you guys, for getting the first Bitcoin ETF. How close are you?
Well, America wants a Bitcoin ETF, so we're close. It really depends on the SEC whether and when they're going to approve it. The final deadline they can approve this ETF or deny it is in 2019. The next decision upcoming is December 29th this year.
Okay, so what's happening on December the 29th and what's the February date? What's the difference between the two deadlines?
So on the December 29th, the SEC may say that we need more time to make a decision on this ETF, and legally they can push it to the next deadline. The next deadline is the February one that I mentioned, at which point they need to make a final decision of yes or no. Okay, now what
makes you think that you're going to be successful? We've seen the SEC booting out many ETF proposals, including many from the Winklevoss brothers that have tried several times to get an ETF proposal through. What makes you think that yours isn't going the same way?
Look, there are a few reasons, Ran. One of them is just VanEck history of building the right market structure for asset classes. So in 1955, John VanEck, our firm's founder, built the first international stock mutual fund in the U.S. In 1968, he built the first gold equity fund, and in basically the past 60 years, we have built market structure and funds for harder to access investment instruments. So we're doing the same for Bitcoin. And it turns out it's actually not an easy question, an easy task to do. So our ETF, what sets it apart is it's a physical Bitcoin ETF, so it stays true to Bitcoin. You own the underlying. It's fully insured. So if there's any theft, hacks, or losses, then the insurance covers it. The pricing that we use for Bitcoin comes from our indexing subsidiary, which is a regulated entity and provided the first financial standard and regulated indices. The ETF is institutionally oriented, so 25 Bitcoins per basket. And we're just trying to do the right things fitting into the U.S. capital markets. So hopefully our experience and our partner Sodex's experience in the blockchain space will help us get through the line. I do believe that America wants a Bitcoin ETF, and at this point the world wants a Bitcoin ETF. So we have quite a job to do here.
I agree with you that America and the world are ready and want an ETF, but we are all in the hands of the SEC. Do you speak to the SEC regularly, or is this a case of submitting a proposal and then just waiting and hoping that they're going to approve it?
So, Ran, VanEck has a 60-plus years relationship with regulators, and we speak regularly with the regulators. So, and we talk with them, iterate the process. It's a back and forth relationship of building the right market structure. I do think that the SEC is open to discussing improvements and proposals with market participants. And again, VanEck has a history of discussing the hard questions, like what we've done with gold and international stocks and mutual funds, and some harder to access countries like Russia, Vietnam, and so on. So we have a history of doing this, and we understand that it's a longer process, but we're doing our best, and the regulators are open, and I'm really hoping that they'll realize that a Bitcoin ETF is their opportunity to regulate the space. So right now the Coinbases and the larger exchanges of the world operate in this semi-gray area, and the regulators don't really do much about it because they don't want to squash innovation, but at the same time they want to make sure that the capital markets stay intact, and I think the ETF kind of solved this question of not squashing innovation and at the same time bring some level of regulation to the digital asset space.
Now, if you remember the last batch of ETFs that was declined by the SEC declined them because of manipulation in the underlying asset. And then Commissioner Hester Peirce came out and said that the SEC actually had no jurisdiction to look at the underlying asset. And if they did look at the underlying asset for various other asset classes like oil or gold, they would never get an ETF passed. Is there anything about your proposal that's currently worrying you?
Well, I think the SEC's primary concern first was market manipulation, right? And so we've built a pricing source that's really hard to manipulate. So we're hoping that we solve that question. The SEC does not have direct jurisdiction to regulate the underlying spot markets. The CFTC does, and a number of regulatory authorities do. So I actually do not understand the problem there. Just yesterday, we've seen news coming out that some JP Morgan trader manipulated the commodities and precious metals markets for 7 years. Every market has some level of manipulation. What we tend to point out is that digital assets and Bitcoin is not unique. It doesn't have more manipulation than others. It might be a nascent or early asset class, but there are market standard tools that we can use to avoid manipulation. So I'm not every effort or is a concern. Like if there's market manipulation, there's a concern, but there are reasonable ways to hedge for that, and we have done everything that we can.
Okay, now work with me here. Let's fast forward to the 1st of March 2019. We've got the first Bitcoin ETF approved, 1 day old. Do we then see billions of institutional dollars immediately flowing into crypto?
Look, like right now, 90 to 95% of the space of the digital asset space are retail. So they invest on trading platforms with not many securities and safeties that investors are used to. So I don't know how much money the ETF would see, and hopefully you're right, Rand, that we'll see an ETF at March 1. But I can see it would be a few $1 billion ETF. We have gold ETFs in the few $1 billion range. There are gold ETFs in the few $10 billion range. So I wouldn't be surprised if a Bitcoin ETF would be in the few $1 billion range. And the important part there is just one sec. The important part there is if you have few $1 billion managed in a financial instrument, you have to make sure that it's not lost, it's professionally managed, an exchange doesn't run away with your money and all that. So that's one of my reasons to believe that there would be demand for a Bitcoin ETF.
I know when you guys presented a proposal internally to launch a Bitcoin ETF, you created a spreadsheet of sorts. And in the spreadsheet, you guys had internal projections of the potential uptake of a Bitcoin ETF if it was successful. In your projections, what kind of uptake did you forecast? And of course, we'll keep this between us.
So in our projections, it could be anywhere between 0 and a few $10 billion. It's a very wide range, and we think that everything depends on how the underlying market structure and regulatory approvals shape up in the next few months to a year. So it's hard to tell. We are optimistic, and I think if there will be a Bitcoin ETF, and hopefully it will be our ETF, then Bitcoin is here to stay for a century or more, and it will be multi-billion-dollar asset class on the ETF side.